Good morning. I'm Jennifer Owen. This is Brad Cox, and we're co-founders of the Owen Cox Dance Group. Brad is a composer and a musician, and I'm a dancer and a choreographer. And we'd like to thank Brooke and the Creative Mornings team for inviting us to be here today. Of course, the Kemper Museum and all the sponsors. Brad and I first began collaborating together on music and dance projects in 2002. We actually met in 2000 and were married in 2003, but that's a different story altogether. I won't talk about that. From an early age, I knew that I wanted to choreograph, and when I became a professional dancer, I choreographed whenever I had the opportunity. When I started collaborating with Brad, however, I found that working with a composer on a new music and dance piece opened me to new ideas and approaches in my choreography. While it's wonderful to choreograph to music that already exists, and I still do that quite often in my work, I found that creating a new work with a composer becomes in many ways a much more personal and creatively rich experience. It's kind of an artistic adventure. In working with the composer, I had the unique opportunity to find out the motivation and inspiration behind the music. I could request changes in the length of certain passages. I could even have my choreography be the impetus for the musical composition. It's a rare gift to have such a close relationship with an artistic collaborator. In 2006, we wanted to work on a much larger scale, and so I retired from my professional ballet career and we formed Owen Cox Dance Group together. Our ensemble's mission is to create new music and dance collaborations, to present high-quality contemporary dance performances with live music, and to engage as wide an audience as possible through affordable live performances and education and outreach programs. Through our performances, we not only collaborate with each other, but we often involve visual artists, costume and lighting designers, and other artistic collaborators. Owen Cox Dance Group also collaborates regularly with other arts organizations. We've worked with the Charlotte Street Foundation, the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art, Bach Aria Soloists, New Ear Contemporary Chamber Ensemble, the People's Liberation Big Band of Greater Kansas City, Kansas City Chamber Orchestra, and the Kansas City Civic Opera Theater. We also have an ongoing partnership with Paseo Academy of the Fine and Performing Arts, and for the past 5 years, we have been able to involve some of their most advanced dance students in our annual production of The Nutcracker and the Mouse King. This provides students the unique opportunity to rehearse and perform alongside professional dancers in a live theater production. Owen Cox Dance Group also recently launched Take the Stage, a year-long in-school dance residency for students in the Kansas City area. While these collaborations between arts organizations or collaborations with educational programs are of great importance to us, for today's talk, we would like to focus on artistic collaboration between individuals.
So if you're involved with the arts community, you may have noticed that collaboration has become sort of something people like to talk about a lot. It's a little bit of a buzzword in a way. I have a friend who was on a panel a couple of years ago, and he commented to me afterwards that he felt like the presenters there were actually in some sort of competition to just see who could say collaboration the most. And for me, I'm a composer, but my background is primarily in jazz music, and so this sort of struck me as odd, because if you're a jazz musician, collaboration is just the norm. It's what's sort of expected. All of the musicians there give a high degree of input, but it's certainly not the case in every field of the arts. You know, I mean, we would all recognize, I think, that say visual artists very frequently will work in isolation. But even among performing arts groups, where it would seem that nothing's going to happen without a high degree of collaboration, there are lots of things that are structured hierarchically that seem to clamp that down a lot, the amount of collaboration that might happen. In fact, in general, I think we could just say that the larger the structure, the less amount of creative collaboration is going to happen. there. Some of you may be familiar with a study that was done by Richard Hackman a few years ago, about 20 years ago, I believe. It got a lot of interest in the music community because what it found was that this particular study found that the highest rate of job satisfaction was found among musicians in string quartets, in professional string quartets, while musicians in professional symphony orchestras were much lower on the list. Not at the bottom, but they were in that sort of 50 percentile rank, one step below federal prison guards, actually. And I think we can sort of generally assume that musicians or performing artists in general are kind of hardwired to want to give input, to want to engage in a creative collaboration. And we can also, I think, certainly say that chamber music musicians, the guys that were highest on the list there, they work in a tradition where that's the norm. There's a high degree of creative collaboration in the musical decision making. Whereas if you're a symphonic musician, that's a very top-down approach. So if you're in the middle of the viola section, or if you're, the guy in the back who counts 358 measures of rest and then hits a triangle, then you're not going to have a high degree of artistic input. And so the artistic input, it kind of keeps the artist happy, right? But if that's the whole reason for creative collaboration, then that's really probably not enough. Because keeping artists happy is relatively simple. You can do that with a reasonably good bottle of wine. But artists have very specific, we have a pretty narrow range of what really needs to happen. And it all comes down to the work itself. As a composer, my goals are very, very simple. It has to do with what something sounds like. So whatever the process in getting there, it can be, I can write whatever thesis I want on it, and if the sound that hits the listener's ear is not that good, then I've failed, right? So if we're talking about creative collaborations, then the real goal then is does it make things better? I mean, we all know that collaborations can be kind of a pain, I mean, sometimes it takes longer to get things done. Sometimes, sort of ugly disagreements can arise. We certainly know that just having more input doesn't necessarily equal better decision making. In fact, sometimes it even gets a little more expensive economically to produce. So does artistic collaboration create better art? And to this, I think we can unequivocally say maybe, perhaps. It all depends on how it's structured. The structure of this creative collaboration is every bit as important and has to be considered just as carefully as making the art itself in isolation. With our work with Owen Cox Dance Group, Jennifer and I have engaged in a lot of creative collaboration, as she mentioned. We find it a very invigorating and vital part of our artistic process. We're certainly not experts in this subject of collaboration, but we've done it a lot, and so we would like to maybe just kind of share some of the things that have worked particularly well for us. It's interesting, as artists, we don't really tend to examine the things that work well that much from our own work. I certainly think about it a lot when something fails, but when something goes well, it's almost as though I don't want to jinx it by thinking about it too much. I examine and inspect other people's work a whole lot, and analyze that a whole lot, but my own work I don't very much. And so we hadn't really thought about what makes a collaboration work or not a whole lot until Brooke asked us if we would do this talk. Now, in terms of the benefits of artistic collaboration, I think probably the most obvious thing is just an exposure to new ideas. And I mean that very broadly, you know, meaning new perspectives, a new inspiration, or particularly, for me anyway, new ways of approaching the work process itself can be very, very interesting. I think a good example of this in our work might be with some of our work that we've done with Nate Fors. Nate is a visual artist. He's a NEA fellow. His work is in the permanent collection of many prominent galleries and museums, including our own Nelson Atkins Museum of Art here, just around the corner. The first time we ever worked with Nate, we did a piece called Bottom of the Big Top, which was sort of an imaginary circus sideshow, you know, populated by misfits. And so Nate suggested that since he'd done a lot of artwork with inner tubes, that the dancers should wear inner tubes and crash helmets. And it will not surprise you probably to be told that Jennifer and I had not thought of this idea. But you know, something that's interesting about those is that, you know, once we start putting these kind of things on the dancers, it obviously changes how they're going to be able to move. So that ended up, in turn, affecting Jennifer's choreography. The piece, we had these little, we called them tubes, you know, tutus made out of bicycle inner tubes. There's our whole cast there. Of course, a piece needs to be about more than just sort of visual oddities. And this piece ultimately ended up sort of becoming very much about empathy for society's marginalized, although done through a humorous way. And that sort of brought to an interesting thought about that process itself as well, because if we had done that the other way around, if we had sort of made this big goal, well, we're going to do a piece about the marginalized of society, you know, we probably wouldn't have ended up with this. You know, I would have done something more obvious about, you know, but anyway, it's very interesting how these things can kind of just come around to where we end up sometimes. On a more practical level, of course, collaborations with other artists from other disciplines can bring an experience that Jennifer and I might lack, or on an even more practical or business level, such collaborations can expand audience and provide a greater media exposure. But I think we said we weren't going to talk about that side of it, so we'll just erase that. We're going to talk about art here. So what makes a collaboration work then? I think for Jennifer and I, as we kind of talked about this, we identified a few different key points that work very well for us. Probably the first point is to simply make sure that there's a common goal to the piece. Now that it might seem on some level like the most obvious thing, it just sort of goes in the no-brainer category. But it's actually not. It's actually kind of easy to miss, because when you bring together artists of different disciplines to collaborate, they're going to bring different kind of artistic priorities. What is an artistic priority for them, the work. And at the heart of it all, for our pieces, we have to keep focused on the fact that we're making a dance piece. And that, again, it may seem obvious, but over the past few years, I've seen a lot of dance pieces that look like they're being staged for the promotional photos rather than actually making a dance piece. You know, there are these things that any isolated moment I might think, well, that's quite visually beautiful, but the whole thing doesn't hold together cohesively as a piece. Or for myself, certainly there are aesthetic choices that I would make for a non-dance piece for the music that I wouldn't possibly do when I'm doing a piece for dance. This next example that we're going to show, this video example, is one of those. It's played by a jazz ensemble in Nonette that undoubtedly would have approached this music differently had it not been for a dance piece. And I think Jennifer's going to introduce this video then for us.
Yes, this is an excerpt of a piece called Theme and Variations for 9 dancers and 9 musicians, and we created it in 2012. For this piece, we wanted the music and the dance to be closely connected, though at times the music is improvised and the dance is choreographed to rhythmic punctuations. We'll show a section that is a canon, and the choreography reflects the structure of the music. In the beginning of this example, the dancers are dancing to improvised music set around a certain form and rhythm. When the canon begins, the dancers follow the canonic lines.
Another thing that we've found very important in putting together the collaboration is to have a high degree of flexibility and fluidity in terms of our interactions among the artists, but with some very definite and defined roles. Jennifer and I very often make suggestions to one another in the course of creating a work, and this whole work process is flexible, it's open to change. At the same time, we recognize the general roles of composer, choreographer, visual artist, and so on. And we don't attempt to actually do the other person's work. So I might offer certain examples or suggestions for how a thing might progress, but I'm certainly not going to try to choreograph the work. This happens, of course, between the dancers and choreographer and the musician and composer as well. Like in the next example that we're going to play, the music was the Victoria Botero, an operatic soprano. She was the only live musician involved, and then there was a lot of looping and samples involved of her voice, so various layers of samples and loops of her voice. As an operatic soprano, Victoria did not have a lot of background in doing looped music, and so we got together a lot and recorded a variety of vocal experiments, which became sort of the basis of the compositional work. But there was a very clear distinction between who got to make sort of the final decisions, I suppose. And I think Jennifer had a few other points on this next video.
So this piece is called A Body of Work. We created it in 2014 in collaboration with Nate Force. And this was the 5th time we'd collaborated with Nate. Nate created the video art for the piece. He shot some of the video material in the rehearsal with the dancers, and some of the footage was of our baby daughter, Cecilia. All of the sampled sounds came from one of 3 sources: Victoria's voice, sounds made by our baby daughter, Cecilia, or sounds that the dancers' bodies made when dancing. Some of the samples were generated live by the dancers, becoming an integral part of the music. In this respect, my choreography became a collaborative component of the musical composition.
one other sort of essential component for us about any creative collaboration among artists is simply the correct combination of people. As a person who has a great love of jazz music, I've made a little bit of a study of the genius of Miles Davis in putting together an ensemble of the right combinations of musicians to make the perfect band. While we make a point, Jennifer and I make a point of always working with the most accomplished dancers, musicians, and artists that we can, that's not necessarily the end of the story, because the best musician is not always necessarily the right musician for a given project. And in addition, sometimes introducing a different artist or a different kind of artist with a different perspective can lead to some very, very interesting results in creating new work. This next video excerpt that we're going to play features a choreographed dance to an improvised musical accompaniment. While we do this from time to time, the approach is relatively rare in our work. But in this particular instance, we were working with a couple of great musicians, Mark Sutherland and Helen Gillet, and we felt extremely confident in trying this approach with this particular combinations of musicians and dancers, because it was the right group for it.
Yes, this is a piece called Memory Palace. We created it in 2014. It was in collaboration with Helen Gillet, Mark Sutherland, and Peregrine Honig. And the piece is inspired by how memories are formed and how they disintegrate. For certain sections of Memory Palace, I asked each of the dancers to share a childhood memory. I then choreographed a solo based on the dancer's memory in silence and had the musicians improvise to the dancer's movements. And the following video is one of those solos.
But I think the thing that we have found to be perhaps most important in any of our collaborations is simply an openness to new ideas, to the new. Perhaps I think we've tried a number of different approaches to creating dances over the last 8 years as we've been working with Owen Cox Dance Group. Certainly not all of them have been successful, but when we get together with other artists and everybody's focused on the same goal and everybody's open and everybody's working at their best, there are some absolutely magical things that happen that don't happen when we're just working all on our own. And that just requires an openness to a variety of possibilities. And so we find this to be sort of the most important principle that we always try to follow with this. We've got one more little video excerpt to show you that Jennifer's going to introduce.
So the last video we'll show is another excerpt from Memory Palace. We call this section Fragment and Thread. And for this section, Brad and I wanted the music and dance to reflect how memories are formed and how they disintegrate. The dancers often move across the rhythm of the music and sometimes stop their movements abruptly, as though a synaptic connection were severed. This section begins with very simple phrases of music and movement that grow more complex and active, as a metaphor to how neurons in the brain develop more intricate pathways as memories are formed, and how they disintegrate over time or with onset of disease.
Well, this brings us to the end of our talk, and this would be the appropriate moment to make sort of a bold pronouncement on the nature of creative collaborations. I've found that anytime I make a bold pronouncement, 6 months to a year later, I wish I hadn't said it. So I think the bold pronouncement is simply that the creative and collaborative process is sort of an ongoing thing that changes over time, and that we just have to be very open to whatever might happen there.